Young Professionals IAFSM Group webinar. We appreciate everyone's support and participation. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the speakers and the topic real quick. So for our first webinar series presentation, we have Karen Cabas and French Wetmore. Both Karen and French have extensive experience working in the stormwater and floodplain management field. And they're both involved with the kind of kickoff of IAFSM in the early days of getting floodplain management pulled together in Illinois. So they both have really good experience, and we thought they'd be great speakers for this particular topic. So quickly, just give a little bit of background on kind of the format. So we're gonna have about an hour for the presentation. We'll leave a little bit of time for Q&A. If you have a question, please submit it. If you have a question during or at the end of the presentation, please submit using the group chat, and I'll make sure to monitor the chat as French and Karen are speaking. If there is some time during the presentation when we think there's a good pause, I'll try to bring up the question to French or Karen if it's a good time. If not, we'll try to wait till the end and make sure to address all the questions that we have. We'll also be sending out PDH and PDH-CEC certificates to all the attendees. We'll be doing this using the email addresses that everybody used to log in. So keep a lookout for that. I'm gonna send that out this afternoon, also with a brief survey. So if you can fill that out, we definitely appreciate it to get some feedback for future webinars. If you don't receive this email for some reason from me, or if you use a different email address and I just don't have it, then please shoot me an email. Maybe wait until end of day tomorrow if you don't see anything, and then I'll make sure to get you a PDH certificate. But we appreciate everyone joining. We're gonna do a quick poll just to get an idea of the audience. I'll leave like 30 seconds for each question. We just have 3 quick questions about your background, just to give the speakers a little bit of input on who's in the audience. So I'm gonna start it right now. All right, well, we'll, almost there. That's probably good. Thanks to everyone answering. Looks like we've got a majority of engineers, some local officials, and then a few other scientists, regulators, and other people. So it's good we have a good mix. I'm gonna move to the next question. Just if you can indicate your years of experience, that would be helpful. All right, looks like we've got a good variety of years of experience. Glad to see that we've got a good diversity of people in the audience. I'm just gonna move to the last question real quick. If you could indicate if you have your CFM or not, just to kind of track who's in the audience. Cool, I'm gonna close that. Looks like majority of people have their CFM, slightly more than half, but there's still several people who don't. So we'll talk a little bit more about the CFM in French and Karen will explain why it's important. So now I'm going to pass this to French Wetmore, and he'll start off the presentation, and hope you guys enjoy. French, take it away.
You bet. Got it, Adam. Good morning, everybody. And this is not just French, it is the French and Karen show. And we notice this is Zoom that a lot of people can usually show their pictures up there. And usually they're live pictures of what they're doing. Karen and I talked about this and decided we should show our pictures too. So we have got pictures when we too were once young professionals. And this is the typical young female professional juggling 12 different jobs and kids. And this is the ruggedly handsome young professional. He actually still looks exactly like this, with sideburns and good long hair.
So those of you that don't know French, this is probably one of the first times I've seen a picture of French without a shiny dome on top.
It is actually, you can see in the upper right corner a happy birthday sign. This is my birthday 2 months after I started work at the Illinois Division of Water Resources in 1976. And to put a timeline on it, that little kid with the blonde hair on the left is now a 46-year-old professor at Arizona State University. And I'm sure, Karen, your kids are a little bigger than they are shown there too.
They are. That baby is still in college, fortunately.
But the young professionals there really came in on this field at a really good time. And we want to tell you about the beginnings, including going back, believe it or not, before we were around. In the beginning, there were floods, and the first thing folks did about floods was respond. And so response was the first activity, typically by your neighbors. Eventually, the government got into it. Now, this is an interesting picture. You notice the raising the arm and pointing up to the sky. That's something responders do. I'm not sure why. But when it became more of a government activity, they followed suit. And over the years, the government put in a bigger and bigger role in response, first considering it as civil defense, and then later with regular agencies devoted to responding and taking care of hazards. After a bit, they realized it's one thing to respond, you really need to help people in the usual phrase of getting back to normal. So that was the idea behind relief, that folks, the government and others should help people, particularly in this case with temporary housing, and in other cases in helping them rebuild. Initially, that was private industry. It should have been the insurance industry. As you probably know, the insurance industry looked at flood insurance and concluded the only people who are going to want it are the people who live next to the rivers and on the coast, and you won't be able to spread the risk. It doesn't make financial sense. And so they did not get into the business. That meant that flood relief was up to charities and Red Cross and to the government if the government would then get involved. And so what the government did actually was got involved with relief on the bigger floods. And there was no particular organization to it. Every disaster had to go to Congress. Somebody had to go to Congress and get special authority to do something which may be different than what they did in the last flood or the last disaster. 1950, they got organized and came out with the first Federal Disaster Act. It was revised and reorganized in 1974. And the most recent version you've probably heard of, the Stafford Act. So each of these brought a change. The biggest change with the Stafford Act, from our perspective, is that it incorporated mitigation as a role as part of relief and a government responsibility. The next thing the government and others said, well, why are we going through this? Why don't we fix the problem? And by fix the problem, that means you build something that stops flooding. Those are levees. They've been around for as long as there have been settlements in this country. But again, it was kind of an ad hoc thing and done locally, generally, state somewhat, not always part of the federal role unless it was related to navigation. Then along came a flood in 1913, which still ranks as the worst flood, the highest flooding Ohio ever got. And following that, there came up with a new law, the 1917 Flood Control Act, which concluded, among other things, that flooding actually was a federal concern and the federal government should be involved. Another big one came in 1927. This was one of the more famous floods in our history. If you'd like to know more about it, get the book Rising Tide. It's a great story about during the flood and afterwards. And here again, the Fed said, we do have a role here, but let's not do it alone. And one of the things in that act was that it incorporated local participation, which is a fancy word for cost sharing. Afterwards, we had another disaster called the Great Depression, and we did have a couple of new laws there. One was creating the Tennessee Valley Authority, and then the 1936 Flood Control Act, and that was the first of what turned out to be annual laws. Every year they would pass another Flood Control Act that would identify projects and things the federal government should do. Just about all of these focused on structural flood control, such as levees and reservoirs. But that wasn't the only thing they were thinking about that then. There was some non-structural considerations, and another flood in 1937, one of the worst floods on the Ohio River, which actually flowed across southern Illinois over to the Mississippi. An interesting activity then in Illinois. Here's a small town in Illinois on the Ohio River. It got flooded in 1883, in 1898, in 1913. Every time it flooded, their response was to raise the levee. 1937, Ohio River flood hit them the worst, and their response was, let's not do this so many times and raise the levee and get flooded. And so what they did was one of the first recorded, documented evacuation projects. They moved the town 3 miles uphill. And this is Shawneetown, Illinois. The folks moved, but unfortunately not all of them moved. It was a voluntary relocation, and a bunch of folks stayed in the old location, improved their levee, and in 1956 actually incorporated as another city as Old Shawneetown. Its population nowadays is less than 200 people because they've been flooded since then, but it's really a great place to visit if you want a neat piece of Illinois history and you're down in the southeast corner of the state. Take a look at Old Shawneetown and some of the old structures there. At one time, Old Shawneetown was one of the 2 most important cities in Illinois. We're talking like 1818. And New Shawneetown was built with the 1930s, 1940s architecture, like Art Deco. Very interesting place to go. But it's a non-structural project, and it worked if you were one of the people who moved to Shawneetown and didn't stay in the old place. So with all these ideas going around, you've got response, you've got relief, you've got flood control, you've got alternative methods. Along came, of course, as we know, the most important and greatest approach of all, and that is floodplain management. We trace the foundings of our profession of floodplain management to Gilbert White. And maybe you've probably heard his name. You may not have known Gilbert White was an Illinoisan. He grew up in Chicago. He got his bachelor's at the University of Chicago. He got his PhD at the University of Chicago. His PhD thesis, which he wrote in the 1930s, actually became published in 1945. It's called Human Adjustment to Floods, and he looked at all the flooding histories of, I shouldn't say all, he looked at flooding history and construction of flood control measures and found that in spite of the money we've been pouring into reducing flood losses, we've had actually increased flood losses, and that maybe we should think a different approach, which is not build in the way of flooding, put something between us and the flooding, but maybe build away from flooding. So that was his ideas, and he went out and spent a lot of the rest of his career promoting that approach. In 1951, there was a bad flood in Kansas City, and in the response, in the disaster response to that, there was a law that adopted and created a federal flood insurance program. You all think it was started in 1968, but actually it was created in 1951. But as things often happen, there was never any money provided for that, and so it actually drifted away and disappeared.
French, do you mind if I ask you about that real quick before you go on? So actually, yeah, there was a national program created in 51?
On paper.
On paper, okay.
But it never actually, as far as I know, was never staffed, because I know it was never funded.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm. So they had some great thinkers back then. And in the traditional flood agencies during the 50s and 60s, they were starting to look at different things. The Tennessee Valley Authority started a mapping program, and in that process, they created the idea of the regional flood and the floodway. And they started taking out a few maps of communities with this information on it. And they stepped back and said, okay, now you got the information, go fix it. And they discovered after a few tries that people said, thank you for the maps, and they didn't do anything. They didn't take any steps, adopt regulations, or do anything. Meanwhile, the Corps of Engineers was debating the pros and cons of human adjustment approaches to structural projects, which ones made the most economic sense, which ones had the best benefit cost ratios. They did some research. And one of the products of this effort was a great publication in 1958 called Regulating Floodplain Development. And this was written by an engineer who has had good reputation in the Corps and otherwise. And this document was designed to say there is an alternative, here's how could it work. And interesting enough, it was published by the University of Chicago, where Dr. Gilbert White, after having jobs elsewhere, came back to be a professor of geography. The Corps also started a program called Floodplain Information Services, similar to the TVA's mapping and providing information to people. So there were these efforts out there. An interesting personality in all of this is a gentleman by the name of Jim Goddard. The TVA efforts were led by a planner by the name of Flash Gray, who was well known in planning circles, and he was the flood person, amongst other things. And they concluded that if they're going to change the way they deal with flooding, they needed an engineer to give it credibility. And Jim Goddard was one of their engineers, and they promoted him up to be like chief of flood engineers. And he came up with a lot of non-structural ideas. And he was so good, he actually got hired by the Corps of Engineers. So he moved over to the Corps, working with the Secretary of the Army and head chief of engineers, and started some of these non-structural ideas. So you have the two founders of our work, Gilbert White and Jim Goddard, and those names may be familiar with you because the Association of State Floodplain Managers' highest award is called the Goddard-White Award. So moving on from the 60s into 1965, got another flood, 1965 on the Mississippi River. It was actually the flood of record for the upper Mississippi and the northern part of Illinois. And that got Congress enough interested to say, what else can we do about this? They created a task force. Jim Goddard was on it. Gilbert White was the chair of it. And that produced a document called House Document 465, calling for a unified national program for managing flood losses. And within it was also a call to create a national flood insurance program. So now we have in Congress written records and recommendations for doing something other than the previous efforts of relief and response and flood control. Also, about this time, there was a growing interest in protecting the environment. So we now have another little interest, somebody else pushing for alternatives to flood control. And that started to catch on. So you had a kind of a convergence of the expert opinion, the environmental movement, and what they needed was a spark. So come along 67 and 68, we got that spark. Don't know how well you remember those days, but one of the key things that happened, especially in the summers of those 2 years, was urban riots. And the riots got a lot of attention for congressmen in the big cities. And they were told by their businesses, the store owners and all, that the riots, they ended up with their property burned down or destroyed, and insurance companies would not sell them any insurance, no fire insurance, because they were in a bad part of town where riots were expected. So insurance companies backed away, and Congress says we got to do something about this. So the big city folks who would like to see riot insurance talk to the folks along the Mississippi, and especially in Louisiana, who were interested in flood insurance. And there's your spark, and there's your convergence. And the result was the National Flood Insurance Act of 1968. That was put into an organization called the Federal Insurance Administration because it would deal with both riot insurance and flood insurance. And that went in the most logical place, which is the Department of Housing and Urban Development, where you deal with things like federal housing loans. You can deal with insurance and similar financial issues, and also deal with local governments. Now, the program kind of started out slow. They worked out the details. One of those details also in 1968 was a conference of experts in the University of Chicago campus. And one of the products they came up with was that for the flood insurance program, you needed a national standard to treat everybody equally. The flood of record is not a national standard. Let's go with the 100-year flood. So that is a product of Illinois also, which we now call the base flood. Program started slowly, as I mentioned. This is a graph of community participation. A few communities got interested, and they looked at it, and may not have done much with it. So what happens next? Why, of course, it's time for another disaster. In 1972, Hurricane Agnes dropped huge amounts of rain on Pennsylvania and New York and up in the Northeast. And they found that some of the communities that were hit were actually in the flood insurance program. People could buy flood insurance, but few had it. I remember numbers like Wilkes-Barre, which is not a small town, got hit particularly bad, and there was something like 2 properties that had flood insurance. So Congress says this won't do. We've tired of paying out disaster relief money, so they passed a Disaster Relief Act, and in that Flood Disaster Protection Act, they added a key provision to the National Flood Insurance Act, and that is, if you're going to have federal money in the floodplain, that money needs to be covered by insurance. So that what that really hit was, as you know, mortgages. So if you have a bank with FDIC or a lender that's federally regulated, there is a federal connection, and those folks are going to have to require a flood insurance policy to cover every loan or mortgage that's secured by an insurable building. That had quite an impact because people still wanted to buy houses that were in the floodplain. They still wanted to build houses and didn't care where they were. So the result of that act was a major change to the program participation. And you can see what happened to participation following the 73 Act. You probably recognize this curve. This is where the coronavirus levels off, and we flatten out, and everybody gets to go back to normal. Hopefully it will take so many years for that to happen. So another thing that happened soon after Hurricane Agnes, the U.S. Water Resources Council, which coordinated federal water efforts, including flooding, came out with the first unified national program for floodplain management. You heard that term before, in-house document 465, and now the feds, without being a congressional study, are actually implementing and describing how this can happen. And they identified floodplain management as having 4 parts, or 4 things that you can do. The first is to modify human susceptibility to flood damage. That's interesting that they listed that first. That is land use management. That is regulating new development in the floodplains, but it also included redevelopment, floodproofing, doing things like Shawneetown. Modify the impact of flooding is insurance, relief, and other things you can do to reduce the adverse impact on people who were flooded. You modify flooding itself, which is dams, levees, structural projects. And they added something that not all the previous discussions had, and that is preserve the natural resources and restore them so floodplains actually can perform some of their duties. And here's a tip of the hat to the environmental movement that was part of the reason we have a National Flood Insurance Act. So what happens? Well, of course, we had another disaster, and that made another change. This time it wasn't a flood. You may or may not recognize that picture. That is a river. That's the Susquehanna River in Pennsylvania, and that's a place called 3 Mile Island. And in 1979, the nuclear power plant there looked like it was going to do something terrible, melt down or whatever. And we had a little warning time and people got to respond and do things before anything bad happened. But the federal response revealed the fact that the federal response wasn't all that coordinated, sure could have been a lot better. And the answer was the creation of the Federal Emergency Management Agency. So it was charged with coordinating the federal response, and while they're at it, why not do civil defense, disaster relief, and since flooding is a disaster, let's put the flood program into FEMA. And since the Water Resources Council was terminated, unfunded in 1980 or 81, then the Water Resources Council's job of dealing with the Unified National Program was also put under FEMA because that's where the flood insurance program went. So FEMA became the new boss of the flood insurance program. The actual Federal Insurance Administration initially was put in lock, stock, and barrel with no major changes as a separate office in FEMA. And over the years, it got more and more integrated in different activities. And particularly people who work in Federal Insurance Administration would take a job in somewhere else in FEMA, and then after a few years there, they would come back, and it ended up being much more of an integrated activity than as it started. But it also meant that you had a much closer coordination with the disaster response, the disaster relief people, than you ever had at HUD. Okay, another flood, Hurricane Frederick, 1979, soon after FEMA was created. This picture was taken by me standing on a place called Dauphin Island off of the coast of Alabama. That bridge to the mainland was destroyed by the hurricane. And there were folks who said, especially in FEMA, said, why don't we get people off the island? It's been flooded so many times. Let's just get them off. And then there were folks in the transportation industry that says, that's a bridge, that's a road, our job is to replace them as soon as possible. So there was a bit of a discussion between the two parties. Do we get rid of the bridge and move people off, or do we repair the bridge and let people stay? And there wasn't anything that could tell one or the other who won, so they followed their authorities, and the bridge was rebuilt with the transportation money. Following that, the Office of Management and Budget looked at how are we spending our money, and it looks like we're at counter ends because two different agencies are promoting two different approaches. And so the Office of Management and Budget issued a directive that said we need to do a better job of coordinating funding following a disaster. And they said, okay, feds, from now on, you're going to need to do a post-disaster mitigation plan and then spend your money in accordance with that plan. So this is very interesting because it's the first time that floodplain management, floodplain managers start to get into the role of mitigation, which is a corrective measure as opposed to the preventive measure. So instead of focusing our attentions only on the land use and what's going to be built, we now have a role of dealing with what can we do to reduce the hazard to people who are already there. Let me go through one last flood, 1973, Midwest floods. Really hit Illinois badly. The key thing there was it was the first time you had an agency in FEMA, a sub-office that was in charge of mitigation and had money. And they found lots of money to do lots of mitigation. You also, of course, had another federal law passed after the flood. For some reason, they like this word reform, like the National Flood Insurance Program was broken. But the Reform Act did bring some important changes. The insurance purchase requirement rules got tightened up, and agencies had to start doing a better job. It became a permanent funding for mitigation without waiting for a disaster. We created the Mapping Advisory Council, where they went out to the field to folks like us, especially state folks and locals, and said, help us figure out how to do better mapping and what kind of standards we should have. And they codified the CRS, but one of the key things about that was in the codification, they said protecting natural functions is a key part of the community rating system. Even though it's an insurance-driven program, protecting natural functions is a good thing to do, and communities should be involved in that too. So that's the national picture. Now you can tell there's a bit of a pattern there. You get a flood, you learn a lesson, you change the law. You got another flood, you learn a new lesson, you change the law. Let's talk about Illinois and see how much smarter, of course, Illinois was. So Illinois actually had an agency for water way back in 1822. It focused initially on canals, canal construction. And so this morphed into, over the years, to a division of waterways, which was in the Department of Public Works. That
I interrupt you there real quickly. That Canal Commission that created, we were the first, water was the first state agency, I understand, in the state of Illinois. So that was the first.
That's right.
So
that's right.
Kind of history.
That's quite a good pedigree way back. They actually, over the years, developed a regulatory role. There were public waters, so if you use a river for navigation, the Lake Michigan, those are public waters, and if you want to do anything, you need a permit for it. So we actually, from way back, the state agency did a regulatory role. In 1972, the Department of Public Works was replaced by the Department of Transportation, and the Division of Waterways was moved over to the Department of Transportation. We had a flood in 1973, and Governor Walker created a task force on flood control. The state flood insurance coordinator was put in the task force. The task force looked at everything the state could do and came up with some very interesting recommendations, particularly don't put 100% of your money into structural projects. There are other things you can do, preventive things. Around 73, 74, somewhere in there, they hired a new director of the Division of Water Resources, excuse me, of the Division of Waterways. His name was Dr. Leo Eisel. He was not from Illinois. He was very young and very smart and knew what he knew and knew what he didn't know and relied heavily on his staff. And he started mapping out this new direction. And one of the things he did was change the name of the agency to the Division of Water Resources. In 1976, he created the Bureau of Resource Management, one of 6 bureaus. And so the non-structural people, the permit people, coastal zone people, were now had a bureau chief on equal standing with the structural people, the designers and the builders. This is about the time I came on the scene and got hired in the local floodplain programs office, which was in Chicago, because its primary job was the National Flood Insurance Program, and Chicago was where the, at that time, HUD office of the National Flood Insurance Program was. They have 10 regions in HUD at the time, and now in FEMA, the same 10 regions. And so the 6 Midwestern states were managed out of a Chicago office. So they felt that the state person should be up there, not that many blocks away from the Chicago folks. Plus, Chicago's where so many recurrent flood problems were. Similarly, they had state permit office in Springfield, but one also in Schaumburg, and that's where Karen came in. And I forget what year you came, Karen. It was still in the 70s, wasn't it?
Late 70s, at 77, right?
Yeah. We had a coastal zone management office too, which was designed to do lots of stuff along the Lake Michigan shoreline, not just regulate development, but do improvements and all sorts of neat stuff. And I'll get back to that office in a minute. So during the next 10 years, we had some state activities, and Karen, you're the one in the middle of that, so you get to cover this slide.
Well, what's interesting about what happened, and again, Dr. Eisel probably helped prompt all this, was a philosophy change from flood conveyance, building new flood channels and building levees to protect people from flooding, to looking at flood storage and flood elevation to reduce flood damages. And an important player in that was the PL 566 program that brought the Soil Conservation Service into the Chicagoland area. Anecdotal story, and I haven't verified this, but there was a planning commissioner in Elk Grove Village named Tom Hamilton that came from Oklahoma that supposedly had dealt with the PL 566 program there. And when he saw the flooding happening, he said, why don't we do something with the SDS guys and have them get involved? So it was a very interesting relationship that went on for about a decade or so. And at one point, there was even an office out at Morton Arboretum that was staffed by a combination of MWRD, Soil Conservation Service, NRCS staff, and also by folks from the USDA, NRCS, and the Division of Water Resources. The state programs also, when they came in for the 566 program, they really said, we really would like to make sure that if we, a federal agency, are going to be spending money on flood control reservoirs and other projects, that the state is doing their share and that really the locals are doing their piece. So basically it came into the concept of, we'll help you, but you're going to have to start regulating the floodplain. So that meant the floodplains were first identified, and then there were maps created. And this goes back to the 70s, and then the state floodplain regulations were created. So actually starting with the North Branch watershed, which is one of these watersheds the SCS was looking at flood control reservoirs on, the state actually did floodplain regulations. That meant that if someone wanted to put an addition into their house in the flood fringe, they had to come to the state for a permit. And that expanded for the Chicagoland area, for all those watersheds where the 566 program was involved, and also the Rock River. The other thing that's important about that is now you start having a program that you had floodplain maps that are created using not something simple like Manning's equation, but for the engineers in the audience, computer backwater models. SCS used WSB2, which is very similar to HEC-RAS. And so a lot of the consulting engineers in Chicago area really caught off guard because, again, they were used to using something like a very simple equation for calculating flood elevation. So at the same time, you had some very sophisticated engineering tools like computer backwater models coming into play. Also was about the same time as the dawn of computers being able to be used by a larger population of people, not just research institutions. So going on to talk further about some of the state programs in that 76 to 86 era, that the key was dealing with local permits. And at one point, the state was able to step back when the flood insurance program became expanded enough and pass off the flood fringe permitting to the local officials, but still stay involved in the floodway permitting. And French, were you involved at all with the Coastal Zone Management Program? French, can you hear me?
Sorry, I put it on mute while you were talking. I wanted to put that Coastal Zone Management bullet in there because they were in the same office that I was at, and they had a pretty good program cooking. This is the story of the legislature giveth and the legislature taketh away. So they created the Division of Water Resources and all of that, but the Coastal Zone Management Office looked like it was going to become a land use authority and tell people what they could and could not do along Lake Michigan shoreline. And who lives along Lake Michigan shoreline but some very rich people with political connections. And they didn't like the idea that some state agency was going to tell them what they could and could not do. And so the legislature disbanded the Coastal Zone Management Program, and we no longer had one, unlike other states that had very good ones. In fact, one of the heads of the program went to Michigan to head Michigan's program, which has to be the choicest job on the Great Lakes. And the other head, the original head, actually became head of the Bureau of Resource Management for a while. But that's what happens when you've got a bad PR, and floodplain management and some of our similar fields have to watch out. That's how people interpret what we actually do. Let me fill in what happened at the local level. This was very heavily National Flood Insurance Program activities. During this time period, you saw that leap in the participation of communities. Maps came out, flood insurance rate maps came out. Most folks' activities in the NFIP at that time was to prepare the maps, review them locally, have a public meeting. Community passes an ordinance, joins the regular program. That's what kept people very busy during those years. A model ordinance was developed that was revised after a bit to coordinate with state permits. I think one of the best things Illinois did, which other states don't have, is this cooperative effort, where the trickiest most expensive part of a permit application is to figuring out the impact in the floodway. Somebody has to do an analysis to show whether there's a rise or not. And the local governments didn't have to worry about that. They simply said, you want to do that, you got to get a state approval. And so the local governments and the building department could regulate the development in terms of protecting new structures. But as far as the floodway analyses, the state could pick up that job. There's also training and, of course, watching over the shoulders of some of the communities and some enforcement actions, which have continued, making Illinois, according to Paul Osman, the most successful enforcement age state in the country, or something to that effect, having more communities with their hands slapped all the way to being kicked out of the National Flood Insurance Program than any other state. And it's paid off, because Paul has showed some numbers that show the relation. I think it was in a recent IAFSM newsletter that showed the relation of the post-flood damage for post-firm buildings was the lowest ratio in Illinois, had the least amount of damage to buildings built according to these rules. So folks who work on, they see each other at training sessions, at conferences, but particularly at the state level, there was concerns that FEMA, or its predecessor HUD, was not running the program as well as it should be. In the Midwest, in Region 5 at FEMA, there are 6 states, as I mentioned. 5 of them, all but Ohio, had state authorities to regulate development or set standards for community regulations or approve local ordinances. And FEMA, or HUD at the time, was kind of pushing its way in, and there was concern that they weren't taking into account state programs. So FEMA actually invited states every year to come to Chicago and meet with them and go over stuff. And that happened in '76 and in '77. In '76, the states got together after the FEMA meeting and started talking. And in '77, they met at the Office of the Division of Water Resources and formally created an organization. By formally, the 6 state representatives there said, yep, let's create it. Came up with bylaws and met a couple of times, twice in Chicago in '77 and '78. '79, it was moved to Minneapolis, and other states were invited. And the word went out to all states that here's a group. Something like 15 states came to that. And I recall meeting the state coordinator for Alaska, no less. And we sat down and talked about our concerns, and they had the very same concerns. It was very refreshing to notice that this was not a unique thing in the Midwest. And we should say that the rest is history. The organization got so effective so quickly. The head of the Federal Insurance Administration in 1980 announced financial assistance for states, which has since become the CAP SSAE program, Community Assistance Program, but it is funding state programs in every state every year to help support the efforts of the National Flood Insurance Program. The management needed to expand, so in '82, Larry Larson, who had been the chair for 3 years, became the executive director. Larry was the state coordinator for Wisconsin, and that's why ever since the national office of this organization has been in Madison. In '82, also, Arizona was the first state chapter created, and that caught on. And in '85, there were contracts with people to be representatives of the state, of the association in Washington.
French, can I ask you a question? My understanding is one concern in the groups, particularly in the Midwest getting together, is that FEMA nationally was using a foot surcharge for floodways. And we in Illinois obviously didn't want it to be a foot, we wanted it to be something less. And many of our sister states are the same way. Was that one of the impetuses?
That was one of the key issues. You had a state standard that was a higher standard than the National Flood Insurance Programs, and that they didn't want to see maps showing 1 foot. Or FEMA, I think, offered, well, we'll put both on and the community can pick which they want, or something like that. And the states really objected, and FEMA understood that and actually the mapping issues kind of blew over pretty quickly because FEMA started coordinating, and states like Illinois created a formal process where a draft map went to Water Resources and the Water Survey, and they were reviewed. And so it actually worked out pretty well, and FEMA can't complain that they've got higher standards statewide. I keep saying FEMA, but actually it's HUD, but it's the same people once FEMA was created. Let's take the same concept down to the state of Illinois. I said in '82 they had the first state association. A couple more started after that. And in '86, we had these annual meetings every year in the Chicago area of the PL 566 groups. And at the '86 meeting, we could sense that there was an interest in a state association. We invited Larry Larson to come and give a talk, and he knew what the situation was, and he put it to the group directly. He said, "You guys got a great program with FEMA. You got a great program with the states. You got some of the best people, some of the best organizations, but do you want to always take your directions from Washington or Springfield? Or do you want to work as professionals and get together and come up with maybe new ideas and things that are maybe you can do better?" And so that's a pretty good challenge. And so right at the end of the conference, we offered a room for people to sit down and talk, and Lou Seidel agreed to chair it. Lou Seidel was the floodplain manager, head of zoning for Peoria County, and was just one of the top people in the state for floodplain management. And they soon came out of that meeting saying, "Yep, we want to do something." And over the next few months, they came up with bylaws and guidance. And this initial group was really neat in that they set the tone, and the tone is those keys listed there. First off, it's not an association of state people, it's not an association of local people. It's an association of professionals, regardless of what job they have. And also, it's not just about flooding. In fact, in many areas, you wouldn't have any flood problems if you could manage your stormwater problems. So the name reflected that with the Illinois Association for Floodplain and Stormwater Management. And the third thing is somewhat still controversial. It's an organization that reflects its membership, and if 75% of its membership is from the Chicago area, then yes, it's a statewide organization, but it is somewhat heavy and oriented toward the Northeast. They have worked very hard to make sure there's a state conference, upstate and downstate. But I think you'll look at the officers and find that it's still kind of heavy where the business is, where the members are.
French, if you like, I can just chip in here because I remember we'd go ahead and I was part of that small group of people. We'd be meeting in Bolingbrook on roughly a monthly basis to try to figure out if we really had something we could make a state association group out of. And we had folks from Lisle, and Lou would come in from Peoria. So the whole group of us were sitting around the table, and very honestly, that meeting where we made the final decision, I honestly didn't think we were going to go for it. And it wasn't until we really said, okay, it's going to be floodplain and stormwater management, that you saw the heads nodding and people say, yes, we can all do that. That's something we all want to be involved in. So that was a very important key to getting this association off the ground, was the fact that it was floodplain and stormwater management.
The interesting thing is that I was not an active member of this. I was a state coordinator, and all I had to offer was some money. The Arizona chapter was started with the help of Les Bond, who was my counterpart for Arizona. And he said, here's how you start a state chapter. You put everybody in a room, and then you get out of their way. And that's what I did. I said, I don't want to be involved. I don't want to do anything. You guys decide you don't want it to be state-centric. And we helped them with some funding for the first conference. And so they picked that up and ran with it. And you can see here the development over the years. And Karen, were you the second chair after Lou?
Yes, I was the vice chair for the first year, and then I became, after Lou stepped down, I was the second chair. And then I was one who put the conference on for the first couple of years. So I put the annual conference on. And it was great because what happened, I'm sorry?
Go ahead, go ahead.
Yeah, what's happened is it also coincided, and we'll talk about this, with some other changes in state laws that occurred at the state level. So it made our conference, we had to be placed. And then the conferences that had been held in the past that were centered around the PL 588 program, the SCS programs, basically did not continue. And so IAFSM essentially took over as the preeminent floodplain stormwater management conference on an annual basis in the state of Illinois. But if you want to talk, we go ahead, French, with the Twilight Seminar.
Yeah, I wanted to mention that it took only 7 or 4 years, as you can see, to get too big for ourselves. That we had problems with not having a single office, without having a single mailbox or anybody checking a mailbox. Mike Klitsky was chair in '91 and held a meeting of what are we going to do about these things, and they came up with the idea of an executive secretary. And I mentioned that because that became very close to home as French and Associates became the executive office, and Mary Lou Wetmore became the executive secretary from then until 2007. And folks said that it really helped make a difference in terms of being formally organized and having a management office. Go ahead, Karen. We are, I'm looking at the clock here, but
yeah, so you can just see some of the activities that IAFSM has grown over the period of time. And the money that fortunately the conference and other activities has raised that would allow us to do another number of activities. So should we go on, Frank?
Just one thought. I think I did a study that said IAFSM by 1997 was the richest of all the state chapters and state associations, and I'm not sure why. I think we had so much good support from the consulting firms and the private sector.
Well, I've got a reason for that, and I'll tell you in the future slide.
Okay, but they actually issued a challenge to other organizations that they would match their donations to the ASFPM. So here shows you some of the growth. Shouldn't be surprising. We went from 0 CFMs, because there was no such program in '87, to hundreds. The same with CRS and conferences, but it's a good story of growth. This was the last time these kinds of numbers were counted, so it's not current. You know the numbers are higher now. So let's go back to what else was happening between '86 and '87 and back then, Karen.
Yeah, so French were involved in this too. So basically we had 2 years of back-to-back floods. As you noted, French had pointed out that it was very important for flood events to get public interest and get organizations or groups to come together to talk about new laws required. So of course, after the '86 flood that happened, unfortunately, it hit some very key legislative districts in the Chicagoland area. And so they got a group of people together, and fortunately, before all that impetus and all that excitement for what they could do went away, they got flooded again in the same area. So already you had a bunch of people who had come together and create some great ideas. And the result was a new statute that basically allowed that you could create countywide stormwater management agencies in Northeastern Illinois, and also allowed for new state floodway authority that would actually have a land use restriction on what could be done with floodway. And slide also notes that floodway land use restriction, and I'm not a planner, I'm an engineer, but French, I know it's very unusual for states to have land use or impose land use authorities, and that was tested in the Illinois Supreme Court in the 1991 outcomes of Beverly Bank lawsuit for someone who wanted to build in the floodway in Flossmoor and Butterfield Creek. And they upheld the state's floodway authority to restrict only appropriate uses in floodway, which was not new buildings, new residences. And as you point out, French, that was really because of the concern of what can happen to other people to have to respond to a flood event to reach those homes, not so much the people in the home, but the so how did you state that, French, for the lawsuit, the public concerns?
Yeah, the issue wasn't that the building was going to be damaged by flooding. It wasn't that the building could cause problems on everybody else. It was not a flooding issue. It was an issue of the building has people who are going to be living in it, and if there's a flood, there is a risk on the government's part for rescue and relief services. In other words, if you build there, even if you think you're safe, you're still going to cost the government money, and therefore that's a good enough reason for the state to say, the land use, which is different from flood protection, no buildings. And that's really the fact that it was held up in an area of relatively low flood hazard, a very shallow, slow-moving floodplain, was a major success. And
well, let's
here's your
talk
other
more.
rules.
Yeah, let's talk about the floodway rules. And I think these were one of the things that was helpful in getting the association really kicked off, because it was about the same time that the new floodway rules that were authorized by that state legislation came into place. They were basically adopted in November of '88, and I was the primary author of those rules. So it was a real interesting experience, and it was, again, some key changes started occurring in how the state regulated the floodplain, floodway area. And particularly, I mentioned the state land use restrictions in the floodway. It really clarified that the floodway was, in Illinois, was a conveyance, storage, and velocity issue. It talked about those rules for the first time, really codified the fact that you had to look at essentially a simple hydrograph and maintain storage that was existing storage below the 10-year flood should be maintained below the 10-year flood, and existing storage between the 10 and 100 should be maintained between those levels. And the idea being that often people would just want to compensate for floodplain storage by digging a hole that would be filled up very quickly. And we wanted to make sure that there was still storage available when the flood peaks would hit at higher flood elevations. It also codified a coordinating floodway map changes that took place with FEMA. That was one frustration I think that people had, is that often there would be new construction would take place, there would be changes to the floodway, and sometimes no one followed through in getting that floodway map updated. And so this codified that there had to be a formal process undertaken as part of floodway map changes in the state rules to go ahead, at least in the Northeast Illinois area, to make sure that the FEMA maps were also updated. So there was an ability to find the most current map and have a good map basis that showed ideally what was the status of that floodway at the time you want to do development. Another key issue is allow delegation to communities, permitting authority. Having had that experience of working in the flood fringe area where we had lots of permits, and it was something that the state eventually did step back from in those PL 566 watersheds. It was very easy to see that if there was relatively straightforward items in the floodways that communities could be regulating or would be regulating anyways, there was no reason for the state to go ahead and also have to issue a permit. So those certain items could be delegated to communities and simplify the permitting process. And it really also looked at more of a watershed view. It sort of anticipated the idea that there would be unsteady flow modeling, that recognizing that you would have to look at the stream system by reaches, and that recognizing that storage was a key component in looking at storage losses and flood conveyance and the velocity of how flood peaks move through an area in part of creating decisions for losses that could take place within a stream reach. The ultimate item that occurred, though, is this required that all the northeastern communities, 260 some communities, had to update their floodplain ordinance. So that was a very big impetus at that time period. So if you notice that the association was created the 86-87 timeframe, we have new state rules in 88. The association became the place to go in Illinois for what was happening and what these rules meant and what you could do in accordance with these rules. So it became a fantastic avenue for the state to use a state association to get information out to folks on how to go ahead and meet the new state floodway rule requirements. So the other thing was happening, we were just a hotbed of activity at that point. Illinois was the place to be. There was also technical studies going on about other things that would happen that you recognize and are aware of in today's ordinances. For example, NIPSI was looking at, based on some earlier work they had done for water quality purposes, did some additional work and looked at dual release rates. The idea that there had to be stormwater release rates, so there'd be a 2-year release rate and a 100-year release rate to help regulate the amount of water leaving a site to do development and making sure our streams are ideally not overflowing due to new development activities. The other thing that's really interesting is the NRCS did, the SCS at that time was called, NRCS did a depressional storage study in both the Butterfield Creek watershed, Indian Creek watershed, that showed that if basically depressional areas, this isn't anything that was being regulated because they weren't necessarily in the floodplain. If these depressional areas are lost, even with stormwater management, good stormwater management, you would have increased flooding. So suddenly you start having a really good technical background for explaining why depressional areas had to be kept. And this is often being used by other folks to help as a basis for why even wetland areas that are not involved in floodplains may be important to be kept so as not to increase flooding.
Okay, I notice we are hit our time here, but I thought maybe give me another minute or two on some of our favorite subjects. The Certified Floodplain Management Program became first produced in, first brought up in 1992 from the state of California. An interesting side note, the person who led the charge for the state of California in his early days, younger days as an engineer, was actually with the Illinois State Water Survey. And then he moved west and took over big things. They created a task force, Certification Board of Regents. It was a step-by-step careful thing over the years as IAFSM looked at alternatives and did the first exam in 1999. The exam has 7 areas, which if you've taken the test, you remember that. The interesting thing is to be a certified floodplain manager, you've got to know more than mapping, you got to know more than permitting, you got to know more than insurance. You've got to know the whole big picture, which is intentional and I think a very good thing. In the early days, the engineers would flunk the regulation section and the permit people would flunk the mapping section. But in the end, when they retook it, they did very well. If you want to know more about becoming a CFM, since only 40% of the folks polled said they are CFMs, you go to floods.org and there's a whole section, as you can see, about the program. The program was created with 2 goals. You want smarter floodplain managers and you want people to recognize floodplain management. There are personal goals as to why you would want to do it. I think the 4 listed here are the number ones. If you have a job, you'd like some demonstration that you know what you're doing, and being certified does that. It also tells yourself you know what you're doing, so it gives you self-confidence. It helps with recognition of not just yourself, but the fact that you have a profession, that you're not just another person sitting behind a desk, you are a professional. And if you want to keep that certification, you've got to have continuing education. And this is one way to do it. It's attend a webinar, but it's also a way to tell your boss, so you want to keep me certified, you need to do it. Just one little story. I was working and met with South Suburban Chicago City. The mayor was at the meeting. The person who had been the usual floodplain manager was also a CFM, and there were some developers at the table. And the mayor introduced the permit person not as the building official or the planner, but this is our certified floodplain manager. Like she thought every city needs one and they had one, and therefore developer, you better listen up. It was very impressive that the mayor had that attitude, and I think if you're interested in CFMs, that's one of the benefits you'll get. Given our time, let me say that we tried to cover the history of floodplain management, what happened in Illinois, formation of IAFSM, formation of the Illinois Association, and certified floodplain management. Maybe we bit off more than we chew in an hour. I don't know about you, Karen. I'm willing to stick around as long as there are questions.
I'm happy to stick around too.
All right,
So
thank
Adam,
you.
it gets back to you.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you so much, Karen and French. A lot of really good information that probably a lot of us didn't know about. So it's definitely great knowledge, a lot of good background information for everyone. If anyone has any questions, if you could submit them now, or if you want to ask, we could also you could unmute yourself and ask a question for French or Karen. If not, then I just wanted to remind everyone I will send out a PDHCC certificate to everyone in attendance. So check your emails. If you don't get anything by the end of the week, please reach out to me and I'll make sure to get you one. There's also a survey. If you could fill that out, we would definitely appreciate any feedback you guys have and any information on future webinar topics or speakers. Does anyone have any questions for Karen or French?
Adam, I know that you're close to time too, so if you want to, I'm sure that French or I would also be able to, if someone wants to email us, their email addresses are up there, so they certainly can email us any questions too if they want after this presentation.
And we did have one additional question. Harold, he asked if the slide deck will be available. So we will be posting, I probably should have said that, we will be posting this, this webinar will be recorded, and we will make sure that the slides and the whole presentation are available. They'll be posted on the Illinois IAFSM website, so probably I'll check maybe within the next week or so. We'll try to do that for all of our webinars so that people can watch them or go back and refer to something. So yeah, definitely a good question. Any other last minute questions? All right, well, I guess probably leave it there. It looks like don't have any more questions, but if you do, feel free to reach out to Karen or French. If you have any questions about the Young Professionals group or anything related to that, feel free to reach out to me. I think everyone has my email. My name again is Adam Bloomstein. Should have my email from the invitation. So thanks a lot, everyone. Thank you, Karen and French. We definitely appreciated your time.
Well, thank you, Adam. I really appreciate you putting this together, and I really appreciate French. French has an incredible background, so most of you don't realize French is now relocated to the Pacific Northwest. So it's great that he was willing to go ahead and come back and help us with this presentation.
It's fun anytime.
Yeah, thank you both.
Great to see this new it's great to see this new organization with the young professionals. If we can help, give us a call.
Yes, appreciate it.